welcome to the show.
Oh, I'm delighted to be here. This is really exciting to be at Farmington today.
Oh, it's exciting for me too. Let's jump right in. We'll talk about your books. What inspired you to write them? You have two of them, Daughters of Long Reach and The Maine Point.
The Maine Point. Well, I'm a retired teacher. I taught high school for 30 years. Not history, but history was always a part of my lesson. I was a Spanish teacher, and I would always connect history, art, and language. And when I moved to Bath, I bought a historic home on Washington Street, right near where all the ships used to be built, and did research on the house and discovered that a major shipbuilding family used to live there and multiple sea captains over the years. And really, what I discovered was so fascinating. I felt that it was a history that I really needed to share. And I come from a Navy family, and I taught in the Midwest, and I was always surprised that they knew so little about how rich the maritime history of America is. And really, it begins in New England, for sure. So Maine in particular has just a sparkling, shimmering kind of maritime history. I call it the shipbuilding, seafaring history of Maine. And I really wanted that to be shared. So I had to write them.
So you were inspired by the maritime history,
Yes.
and the surroundings that you were immersed in.
Places.
And then what prepared you, though? Was it your teaching experience? What prepared you to be a writer of novels?
I always get back to I come from a Navy family, and usually people who go to sea are great storytellers, and my dad was an outstanding storyteller. He spent 41 years in the Navy, from Pearl Harbor to 1981 in the reserves, because he was a machinist mate. And he could keep all those old tin cans afloat, so the Navy kept him in. And he was assigned at Brooklyn Navy Yard, and he told so many stories. So when I arrived in Bath and then connected with the Maine Maritime Museum, I was just prepared from coming from a family that told stories for so long. And I prepared too by reading nonfiction. I read Live Yankees by William Bunting, Maine Odyssey, Owen's History of Bath, Baker's History of the Kennebec region. So I have a lot of nonfiction behind me, but that just infuses the fiction and allows you to have a more personal lens of history, how a family is impacted by historical events. And I think the boom and bust of shipbuilding in Bath and in Maine certainly had long-lasting effects on families.
Most definitely. And so they're historical fiction, but you also bring in the present. You weave the two of them together.
Right. I weave present and past together because I like to show how, well, William Faulkner said it best, and I'm going to paraphrase him. History is, not was. We are products of history, and we are part of history. And so I like to show how it connects, and I'm all about the connections. Everything changes and everything remains the same. And certainly for my family and for many people, the sea, the ocean, is a great connector. So I use that. I use the sea and the tides to connect generations.
And why choose historical fiction over nonfiction?
I think it's because you can be more emotional with fiction. I think that you can also get more personal again. So if you're talking about how it impacts a family, no one really wants to disclose all their family secrets, the good and the bad and the ugly, borrowing a line from Clint Eastwood. So you have to fictionalize the characters, but they're certainly blended from people you've read about, people you know, stories you've heard. And I feel as long as it's the chronology is correct, the surrounding historical events are correct, it's better served to make it more personal. And what I learned in the classroom is no one remembers history unless a good story is connected to it. And it's so important to remember history. We learn so much. It's necessary. So what's the value if no one remembers it? But if you make it personal with a story, somehow it sticks. People identify and connect with it in a different way. So I use the fictional characters to connect with people on an emotional level in hopes that they'll remember the history surrounding those emotional reactions.
And that will spark them to explore more, no doubt.
Hopefully, yes, and have just an appreciation of where they live, the places that surround them, and give them a different viewpoint.
And I think that's interesting. You've lived other places.
many places.
But you
yes.
fell in love with Maine.
Absolutely, and in particular Bath. But actually, a long time ago, I was told there are ocean people and there are mountain people. And without a doubt, I'm an ocean person, but I love the mountains too. And I can't think of another place where you can appreciate both the ocean and the mountains more than in Maine. There are some places you can stand and see both. Even my ride up on 27 from Bath, it was like, this is so beautiful. And not to say other places that I've lived are not appealing, but quite frankly, they can't compare with the natural beauty of Maine.
I agree, yeah.
Just can't. I can name a few places that definitely cannot compare, but I don't want to offend anyone because everyone sees home through rose-colored glasses. And home, I must say that, especially military families, home is a synonym for love. It's romanticized, it's revered. We search for it, in a sense. Because if you're uprooted a lot, it's like, well, where is home? And I feel like I've chosen Bath as home because of the way it makes me feel and the way it helps me connect with both history and the ocean.
Well, it's great you found it at this point in your life then, right? So you
I
were
think
raised
so.
in a military family.
Yes.
And you have a military spouse.
Yes, and my husband has lived both military and out of the military because he served in the reserves for a number of years, which my dad did at the end as well. So I've had both experiences.
Nice.
For sure.
Your books tend to span about 100 years each?
Daughters of Long Reach begins in 1854 and ends in 1910. And the Maine Point picks up with the same family and the same setting in Bath, in Maine, in 1936.
Okay.
And then goes to 1943 in the past. In the present is 2018 to present day. Daughters of Long Reach was more 2014 to 2017 when it came out. So I end the year that I'm publishing, modern day storyline versus the historic storyline.
How many generations of family do you cover?
It really covers 4, and I call it very often the life story of 3 roses. There's a Mary Rose, a Stella Rose, and an Anna Rose that serve as narrators and major characters. I don't want to give away any storylines,
Okay,
and I
won't
love
ask that.
surprises, so there may be another Rose in there somewhere, but it really is 4 generations of a seafaring family.
Wow. Well, obviously it's impacted a number of readers. You're an award-winning, Daughters of Long Reach won an award. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yes, published in 2017. In 2018, Daughters of Long Reach won the Next Generation Indie Book Award for first novel, because it was my debut novel. And I had been writing a blog for a number of years. I've always loved to write, but I had never written a novel before. I wrote a children's bilingual book many years ago. So for first novel in this category, it's a mid-length novel, not too short and not too long. That was a huge honor, very unexpected. They actually gave me the medal at the Lobster Fest. The publisher showed up to do it. I didn't know I had won. And they told me later that Next Generation is an international award, and the new novel category really receives the most entries because, as they said, everybody has one novel in them. So as soon as I heard that, I said, well, I have to write a second novel then. I don't want to capitalize only on the fact that, oh, everybody has one novel in them. So that's when the desire really to write book 2 of what really is a book 1, book 2 story. Actually, to span so many years, you need a second book. Otherwise, you have a tome. You have one of those Gone with the Wind length books, and people today are so busy, they often want it broken up.
Definitely more palatable for most people.
For most people, it's just a
Lifestyle.
little easier to read 215 to 315 pages rather than the 500 and 600 page books that some of us remember reading, like Don Quixote, 2 volumes, that kind of thing, for sure.
Your female characters are really strong characters. What makes them so?
Well, I come from a family of strong women. I think, interestingly enough, I had a quote from Alexandre Dumas about all of human wisdom can be reduced to two words: wait and hope. And I think in military families, the wife, the mother, the sweetheart, the sister, they're all at home waiting and hoping. But that makes them very strong. The expression, keep the home fires burning, whether you're in the 1800s, the 1900s, or this new century, still exists. Those that are left behind, so to speak, sometimes have it the hardest of all. Mm-hmm. And I really wanted to focus on their strength. And also the fact that the male view has been told and retold. Mm-hmm. I don't think there were very many women in Moby Dick.
No.
I can't even remember the name of one. There must have been an innkeeper at the beginning, but I can't remember. So I think I wanted to see the seafaring life from that female viewpoint. And when I started in 1854, women did go to sea with their husbands. Mm-hmm. And that is a huge part of Maine's history. So they were truly seafaring women. Children were born at sea, children were lost at sea, children were educated at sea. And they were really, unlike the astronauts of today, the astronauts were very brave. I call those sea captains that went around Cape Horn in wooden ships to be the astronauts of their age. But they were there with their families.
They were exploring together.
And some of the real stories I encountered, one sea captain who lived in my house, they lost a child in the China Sea, 3 years of age. Mm-hmm. They returned home around Cape Horn, were approaching New York Harbor, and his wife, who had just lost a child, had a miscarriage. And when they docked, they were rushed to Bellevue Hospital, one of the oldest hospitals in New York City. And they saved her life, but they did have a second sorrow, all within one voyage. So I think that there's a lot we can learn from their strength. And there's an expression in my family that says, sorrow can burn you to bitterness or spin you to gold. And I found, as I read about just the shipbuilders and sea captains in my house, one who lost all 3 children while he was at sea and away from them, that they came back. They rebounded, and they lived bold, big, courageous lives and wrote history. That sea captain became a member of Maine State Legislature. And when he died, all of the shipyards, and there were 22 at one point in Bath, were closed. His pallbearers were the greatest leaders of town, owners of major ship yards, entrepreneurs and businessmen and bankers. And they carried his coffin from the train depot all the way up over to the steamboat, crossed the Kennebec, and he was buried in his family plot in Georgetown. So I had just so much respect for their strength.
And you brought those stories to life.
I wanted to, and my readers tell me that my characters feel very real, and I think they became very real to me. And I often blended them, but I was sure that they had those layers. There is good and bad in everyone, and certainly the sea captains reflected that in later years after the Civil War. It was harder and harder to get crews, and because of that, some of the character was lacking in crews. And so discipline had to be increased, and they took a lot of criticism for that. But they also can't speak for why they did what they did. So I just wanted to show them in multiple lights.
Mm-hmm. And where, obviously, your stories highlight and lift up the voices of women,
yes.
Stories of women. You also, though, present the men in a unique way. You highlight their vulnerabilities, their vulnerable side. Not to say weakness, but vulnerability.
I was asked about this. Someone who read my book said, your women seem so strong and your men seem so vulnerable. Why is that? And I have to say I'm a mother of a daughter, but I'm also a mother of sons. I'm a sister. There are more male brothers and cousins in our family than there are female. And I do know that they have very deep feelings. And for my generation, sadly, they were not allowed to cry. Now I think that young men know that it is better to express feelings and healthier to do that, and I support that. But I wanted to show how deeply they felt. For example, there's a scene in Daughters where the young man is going to sea for the first time, and he went down to New York Harbor to meet the ship, Bath built, but in departing from New York, and his mother and father accompanied him. And it is when he says goodbye to his mother that it's very hard. Of course, he turns and does not cry. This is in the 1800s. But I was reminded of a time in the Brooklyn Navy Yard when my brother was going to sea for the first time. He was also in the Navy. And how hard that was, I think. Again, almost all sailors long for home when they're in the middle of the Atlantic or the Pacific. You know, I joined the Navy to see the world, and what did I see but the sea? And there can be a lot of loneliness. And for men that come home and have lost children while they were gone, or lose them aboard ship, they have to remain strong. And yet in this novel, my lead character in Daughters, Captain Henry Goss, his son Thomas Goss goes to sea. In real life, that character lost all 3 children. In the book, I wanted to have hope and optimism prevail. That's very important. So I had the youngest son survive. And the way the character is written is losing 2 children when he wasn't with them changed him. And unlike many others, and it was perceived as weakness by some ship owners and fellow captains, he did show more emotion than was typical of the time. And that kind of carries through even in the present day when I move into the Maine Point. The backstory line ends in 1943, and it's after Guadalcanal, and there's a lieutenant commander who's severely injured. And my father lost a ship at Guadalcanal, the Northampton, and I show some vulnerability there. So I felt that was just very important and healthy for all the boys that are in school reading books too, to see. Yeah.
And so this book is what age group? Is it
this book? When I always talk to students, I taught high school seniors.
Okay.
So although I think anyone who I would say 10 to 100, and someone said why not over 100, but 10 to 100 could read. I don't use. People say I do emotions very well, and I can do a love scene very well, but it is not distasteful. And I don't know why that is, but I've been complimented. There's a lot of emotion, there's a lot of real feeling, but I think I have the heart of someone in the 1940s when I write. And so I really don't have a problem. The one thing, if young people read it, is the loss of children and the loss of mothers and the loss of fathers. And I have actually talked to people who were purchasing a book and saying, I would like to buy this for a 16-year-old or a 17-year-old. And I said, I think it will be fine. I said, I do have to tell you, in particular, there's the death of a mother. And she said, this young woman just lost their mother. And I said, well, you will have to gauge whether she's ready, to read about that in fiction. And I lost my mother too soon, so I'm very sensitive to that. And because I was a high school teacher, students lost parents during those 4 years, and I was very sensitive and aware of that as well. It is part of life, and you can't shield your children from everything. So I do it gently, but I think there's something about reading that teaches empathy, and that's a great takeaway, to read something and feel empathetic and then connect with it and find some help through reading fictional characters. But no, it actually appeals a lot to older women who remember their parents telling stories about the 1930s and 40s, specifically the Maine Point. It's very 1930s, 1940s rich. I actually start the Maine Point in 1936. Here's a little Maine history. We were in the middle of the Depression, and there was the Great Flood of 1936, the Kennebec River flooded. And so the Carlton Bridge was built in 1928, 29, right there, finished. It might have been opened in 29. but the Carlton Bridge held. The Richmond-Dresden Bridge fell. So you had cows floating down with the ice chunks and coal sheds and all kinds of debris.
And that was the backdrop for your...
That was the opening chapter of 1936. And BIW, 1 month later, March 25th, 1936, was able to launch a ship, the USS Drayton.
Amazing.
And here's my historical reference. I did not know this, but the USS Drayton was one of 2 destroyers who picked up the sailors from the Northampton when it was sunk at Guadalcanal. I wrote about the launching of the USS Drayton, and I end in 1943, shortly after the sinking of the Northampton, and mentioned the USS Fletcher and Drayton and PT-109, which John F. Kennedy was the lieutenant in charge of a few years later.
Interesting.
All picked up survivors from my dad's ship. And I wondered why I felt so connected to Bath. Mm-hmm. And now I have to say, if they didn't save him, he could have been picked up by the Fletcher, and I think he was. They saved his shipmates. Jason Robards, the famous actor, was also aboard that ship. So BIW was saving sailors back in the 1940s. And that's what I love about historical fiction, that someone can say, oh my goodness, this ship that was celebrated by Bath because it was a sign of hope that they could get a ship out of the yard after the Depression and then the flood, was also a great sign of hope for all those sailors swimming.
Well, and it's so interesting, too, that you draw that connection between, we would think warship, what's it do? It goes to war.
But it also can, well, that's true, because that destroyer was part of a force shielding an aircraft carrier, so they were basically a flotilla, and part of it, they were the screen. The destroyers were the screen. The Northampton was a heavy cruiser. So, yes, there are a lot of missions of mercy, and I would just like to say the hospital ships and the parallels in history of why do you weave present and past together. In both books, I mentioned the USS Solace, which was a hospital ship. It was the only ship not fired upon at Pearl Harbor. It was there on December 7th, 1941. Wow. And because it was not sunk, as the West Virginia and the Arizona, the Oklahoma were, it was able to get out a few boats with a rescue mission, so small boats to pick up sailors that were literally burning in the water.
Oh, what a great
and they were able to save it. And it was the USS Solace that, in the book, I say those sailors that were picked up at Guadalcanal went to heal. And then the book is launched in March, last March, and shortly after, within a week, we saw pictures of the USS Comfort in New York Harbor. And that blew me away. There's a whole middle section in the Maine Point. I talk about one of the Roses, Stella Rose, who decides to go to nursing school at Lenox Hill Hospital on the Upper East Side of Manhattan to become a Navy nurse. And she winds up on that USS Solace in the Pacific. And I wanted it to be so all the men in my family were in the Navy and all the women became nurses and I didn't. So I have a terrible guilt complex and tremendous respect for nurses. And so I wanted to write about that female contribution. And the nurses in those programs, all hospital programs, they went in as early as the soldiers enlisting after Pearl Harbor. And so that nurse, Stella Rose, is on the USS Solace in the South Pacific when the Northampton goes down. And that is a big part of the story. In some ways, when I wrote this book, there was that sitcom everyone loved, How I Met Your Mother.
Yes.
In some ways, this is How I Met Your Father. It's a much more, it's not a sitcom, that's for sure. I mean, there's lots of, as I get back to sorrow, but it is a little bit of that. And so nurses are really a big part of the story.
Well, you have done an impeccable job of weaving together and lifting up and honoring, it sounds like, both sides of your family. You're the paternal and the maternal, as well as just, it's incredible that you can weave together generations of stories and share them in a way that is accessible for all generations.
Thank you.
We are running short of time, but I do want to quickly let people know that you have these books, but you also have a blog.
I do.
And where can they find that?
BathTimeSociety.com. blogspot.com.
Okay.
BathTimeSociety.blogspot.com. And actually, if you Google Bath Time Society, I don't know how I came up with that name, but it seems like I'm the only blog out there with that name. So
Great.
Bath Time Society.
And your website?
Is www.irenemdrago.com.
Great. And we'll include all that in the credits, and everywhere we post this video, we'll make sure that people can find you to learn more about you and your work and your books.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thanks for being here.
Oh, it's my pleasure.